Hello, my name is Alex and welcome back to my Docker crash course. Now in this video we're going to be going into more detail on volumes. Now in the previous two videos we saw two examples of using volumes. Now the first example was binding a file or directory on a host machine to a file or directory on a container. Now, these volumes are known as bind mounts, and essentially, as the name suggests, you're binding a directory on the host machine to your container. Now, we also saw another type of volume, where the volume is essentially created and then managed through Docker. So we saw an example where we essentially created a volume through our Docker Compose, and then we simply gave that volume a name, and Docker created that volume for us. Now, this was a named volume, and essentially what we did is that we told Docker to create a volume for us and to manage that volume. Now, besides those two types, we have more types of volumes, and in this video we're gonna be exploring different types of volumes and how they work. Now, again, let's begin with something simple and let's actually create a simple bind mount. Now to do that, I'm gonna go into my app directory from the previous video, and I'm actually going to build a simple image from my application here. So as you can probably recall from the previous video, this is a simple counter application, and I'm going to build an image from it. So first of all, let's do a cd and let's go into our app directory. And now we can build our image from inside of our app directory since we have a Docker file present. And the only thing we need to do that is say docker build with the name of the image. And now we can execute this command and this will build this image for us. Now, since we had previously built this image, as you can see, everything was cached, so the build only took 6 seconds. So with that, we can now try and run a container from this image. Now, before we do that, we can go into our Docker here, and we can verify that we don't have any volumes, and we do have an image called counter. Now, with that said, let's try to mount this very directory as a volume. So to do that, let's go ahead and let's try to run the following command. So we're gonna say docker run, then -v, and to avoid any confusion, let's copy the path to this directory and let's place it in quotes. And now we can paste that, and now we need to specify a directory within the container to which our directory should be linked to. So basically, we're linking our directory here to a directory within the container. Now, in this case, let's simply name the directory within the container as test, and now let's specify the name of the image that we want to run. And with that, we can press enter. And now we can go back into Docker, and if we go into containers, as you can see, the container is running. Now, if we click on the container and go to files, down here you will see a directory which is denoted as mount, and the name of this directory is simply test. And if I open this directory up, as you can see, this is mirroring our directory right here. So basically, we created a bind mount of our directory here on our host machine, and we bound that directory to our Docker container. Now again, this is known as a bind mount, and this is how you would approach mounting a directory on your machine directly to a container. So having that said, let's go into our volumes as well. And as you can see here inside of our volumes, we do not have any new volumes created because in fact we did not create any volumes and Docker is not managing any volumes for us. So basically, because we simply bound a directory on our host machine to our container, we did not create any volumes and Docker has no part in managing this directory. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's actually terminate this container and let's try and create a volume which Docker can actually manage. So let's go back, and instead of specifying a path to a directory, in this case we're gonna create a named volume. A named volume will always have a distinct name. So for example, we can name this as volume 1. And Docker is going to create and manage this volume for us. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And now we can go back into Docker. And as you can see, now we have a volume here called volume 1. And basically, this is our volume. So if we go into containers here, if we go into the running container, if we go into files, again, you will see that we have a volume here. And in this case, it is empty since it does not contain any files, but it is in fact mounted to our container, and this will allow for data persistence. So just like with the local directory here, any modifications we make to this volume will be persistent, meaning that even if we destroy the container, the data on the volume will remain until we destroy the volume. Now on that note, let's take a look at how we can actually manage our volumes. So let's go back into our terminal here and let's stop our container. And now with our container stopped, let's try and let's list our volumes. Now to do that, you can just say docker and then volume and then ls, and this will show you a list of all of your volumes. Now, if you want to inspect a specific volume to get more information about it, you can do docker and then you can say volume, inspect, followed by the name of your volume, which in this case is just volume 1. And as you can see, here is the detailed information on your volume. Now, as I mentioned in my Docker Compose video, you can obviously also specify various options for your volumes. And in this case, you can see those options. And these are just the default options. And you can see that, for example, here, the driver is set to local, meaning that the volume in question was created for the local file system. Now, with that said, you can remove a volume by doing a docker volume and then saying rm for remove, followed by the name of your volume, and this effectively remove your volume. Now, in this case, the volume is in use, so we would need to first ensure that the volume is not being used by any containers. So in this case, let's just remove our containers here. And with our containers removed, we can actually go ahead and we can run this command to remove our volume. So now let's go ahead and let's try to create a named volume. So in this case, we can just say docker, then volume, then create, followed by the name of the volume. So in this case, let's just name it volume 2. And as you can see, this will again create a volume for us. Now you can also create a volume, just like I mentioned before, with additional parameters. Now to do that, just like before, we can say docker volume create, but this time we can provide additional options such as the driver by stating the corresponding option followed by the associated property. So in this case, we can just say docker volume create and set the driver to local, and after that we can just simply state the name of the volume. So let's just create a volume called volume 3 and let's just press enter. And now if we do a docker volume ls, as you can see, we have 2 volumes created. Now lastly, you can also remove unused volumes, meaning volumes that are not associated with any containers. And to do that, all you need to do is say docker volume and then prune, and this will essentially remove any unused volumes. Now in this case, Docker failed to remove our volumes, but to solve that we can simply say docker volume prune and then we just say dash dash and all, and with that, if we hit enter and confirm, as you can see now we have deleted both of our volumes. So with that, we've covered all of the commands that you need to know to start managing your own volumes. However, there are 2 more types of volumes that I want to discuss. So the first one is anonymous volumes. We can actually run a new container, but in this case, instead of naming the volume, we will just state the directory on the container to which the volume should be mounted to. So essentially, we're removing the column and the prefix here, and we're simply stating docker run -v for volume, and then we're setting the name of the directory on the container to which the volume should be mounted to. Now by doing that and by executing this command, we are creating something that is known as an anonymous volume. So basically, if I go into volumes here, you will simply see a hashed string, and this hashed string is essentially an anonymous volume. Now, just like a named volume, an anonymous volume will likewise store any data and allow for data persistence, but in this case, we don't really care about giving our volume a name. So usually anonymous volumes are used for temporary data or for testing and development, but in some cases when you don't care about managing your volume explicitly, you might choose to create an anonymous volume. Now, in a little bit, when we actually create a volume with our Docker Compose, you will see that the official Redis image from the previous video is essentially creating an anonymous volume by default to allow for file persistence. So with that said, in this case again, we have an anonymous volume here, and it is not really that different from a named volume, but generally you would not use an anonymous volume too often unless you explicitly know that you do not need a named volume. So in general, the three main types of volumes are bind volumes, named volumes, and anonymous volumes. Now, beyond those three types of volumes, we also have a fourth volume called tmpfs, which is quite different from the other three in the sense that the content of the volume is stored in memory. So instead of writing the content to the disk, you are writing the content to memory. Now, the idea here is that you do not always want to store your data in your disk. In some cases, when you're dealing with sensitive or temporary data, and if you want to access that data quickly, you might want to store your data in memory. For that purpose, we can use a tmpfs volume to essentially create a temporary persistent storage located directly in our memory. Now to do that, we can go back into our terminal, we can terminate our container, and now we will need to modify our command a little bit. So in this case, instead of saying -v, we want to say -- and then tmpfs, and this will effectively create a volume in our memory. Now, this command is not quite complete, and actually in this case, let's go ahead and let's name our volume app and then temp. And then here we can set read and write permissions for our volume. So actually there are quite a few things we can change here and quite a few options we can set, but in the scope of this video we're gonna look at two specific options. So first of all, if you say column and then say R and W, this will essentially give read and write permissions to your volume. And furthermore, we can just say comma, and then we can set the size of the volume, and in this case I want to set it to 100 megabytes, and again this will be stored in your memory, so be careful. So we're setting the size of the volume to 100 megabytes, and basically we're setting the permissions to read and write. Now with that done, let's go ahead and let's actually try to run this command. Now in this case we do not want a space here actually, and we can run this and let's see what happens. So as you can see, everything is running, and if we go back in here, as you can see, there is no new volume in here. So this is our old anonymous volume, but if we go into our containers and if we access the running container, we can go to files. Now in here we have our app directory, and inside of our app directory we have our temporary folder. So basically, we can verify that this is indeed a mounted volume by simply going into our terminal, and in here, let's pull up a new terminal, and let's say docker, and then inspect, followed by the name of the running container, and then we can press enter, and if we scroll all the way up, we should find a section called tmpfs, and as you can see, in here we have our temporary volume. Now, one important thing to mention is that when dealing with memory, it is actually very important to monitor the stats of the container, and obviously you can do this via the GUI, so you can just go into the stats section of the container, And as you can see, this is our current memory usage since our container and our volume is not populated with any data. We have a very small memory usage. But in general, if you want to see the same statistics through a terminal, you can simply open up a new terminal and say docker and then stats followed by the name of your container, and then you can just press enter and you will similarly see the stats of your container. So with that said, we are pretty much done with everything we need to know about volumes. So on this note, let's go ahead and let's actually try and create a volume, but this time we will do it through our Docker Compose. So we can exit off this terminal and let's go ahead and let's delete our containers and let's make sure that we don't have any other volumes. And now we can go back and we can open up our Docker Compose file. Now in here, we want to actually attach a volume to our web application. So we will go into this service and then we will say volumes, and we will start by creating a bind mount. And in this case, we will just copy the content of the app directory here into an app directory on our container. So let's save that and let's open up a new terminal. And now make sure that your terminal is at the location of your Docker Compose, and we can simply say Docker Compose up, and this will effectively run our compose. So now again, we can go into our Docker desktop and we can open up our web application here. We can go into files, and then as you can see, our application folder here is essentially bound to our container. Furthermore, if we go into bind mounts, as you can see, we are binding our application folder here to our directory inside of the container. So having that said, let's go ahead and let's actually stop our containers and let's try to now add an actual volume. So instead of saying .app, we can just say volume1 here. And now we will need to create said volume. So basically under your services, create a volume section, and in here you can just add your volume. And now with this done, we can go ahead and we can run our Docker Compose again. And with our containers up and running, we can go back into Docker. And in here, again, if we go into our web service, as you can see, if we go into bind mounts, we don't have anything. And now if we go into files, we can see that we are binding a volume to the app directory. Furthermore, if we go into volumes here, as you can see, we have two volumes. The first one is this anonymous volume, which, as I've mentioned before, was created by Redis for its own purposes. And then we have our volume right here. So this is the volume that we've created. Now, similarly, if we stop the containers again, we can go back here, we can delete these volumes. So actually, let's go ahead and let's delete this container group and let's delete these volumes. And now we can remove our volume from here. And now let's try and make an anonymous volume, just like we did before. And we're gonna run Docker Compose up. And now with our containers running, we can go back into our Docker UI. And now we have two anonymous volumes. Again, the first one was created by Redis, while the second one was created by us. And with that, we are pretty much done. So basically, in this video, we've looked at four types of volumes, namely named volumes, anonymous volumes, bind mounts, and tmpfs volumes, which reside inside our memory. Now, each one of these has different purposes. In general, named and anonymous volumes can be used similarly and they're managed by Docker. Bind mounts are simply directories on your local machine and you have full control over these. And then tmpfs volumes reside in your memory and are usually stored for either sensitive data or data that needs to be accessed quickly. But keep in mind that tmpfs volumes will expire as soon as you shut down your container or restart your system. So be very careful when using tmpfs volumes. And on that note, that's pretty much it for this video. So hopefully you've learned something new. And if you have any questions or suggestions, make sure to leave them in the comments below. And if you've liked this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Every single like and subscription helps immensely. And on that note, I will see you in the next one.